The morning of June 4th, 1942, dawned over the Central Pacific with that particular quality of light that makes the ocean look like hammered metal. Ensign George Gay sat in the cockpit of his Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bomber on the flight deck of the USS Hornet, his hands resting on controls he had trained with for months, but never used in actual combat. He was 25 years old. The torpedo slung beneath his aircraft weighed half a ton. He had never dropped one from a moving carrier before. In fact, he had never even seen it done until this morning. Around him, 14 other Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 8 prepared for launch. Their engines coughed and roared in the pre-dawn darkness. The deck crews moved with practiced efficiency, checking connections, signaling positions, guiding aircraft into launch sequence. Gay could see Commander John Waldron in the lead aircraft, his silhouette visible against the gradually lightening sky. Waldron had trained them relentlessly, drilled them on tactics until every man could anticipate his commands. But training and combat were different things, and every pilot on that deck knew it. Gay had joined the Navy because the Army Air Corps rejected him for a heart condition. He had left Texas A&M University without graduating, worked odd jobs during the Depression, saved money, and finally found his way to flight school in Miami. The Navy gave him wings in September 1941. 3 months later, Pearl Harbor burned. Now, less than a year after earning his commission, he was preparing to attack the most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled by the Imperial Japanese Navy. The intelligence briefing had been specific. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers approaching Midway Island: the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Their pilots were veterans, their aircraft maintained to perfection, their crews experienced in coordinated strikes that had devastated Allied forces across the Pacific. The American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had positioned themselves northeast of Midway, waiting for the Japanese to commit to their attack on the island before launching their own strike. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Devastator was obsolete before the war even started. Everyone knew it. The aircraft was slow, with a maximum speed of just 115 miles per hour when carrying a torpedo. It was vulnerable, lacking armor protection and adequate defensive armament. Its range was limited, its torpedo unreliable. The Navy was replacing it with the new Grumman TBF Avenger, but the replacement aircraft had not arrived in time for Torpedo Squadron 8 aboard the Hornet. A detachment of the squadron operating from Midway Island had 6 of the new Avengers. The E carrier pilots had to make do with what they had. Gay checked his instruments one final time. Behind him, his radio man and rear gunner, Robert Huntington, settled into position. They had flown together during training, developed the wordless communication that comes from shared experience. Huntington would operate the single .30 caliber machine gun that constituted their defensive armament. Against Japanese Zero fighters, it would be like fighting with a pocket knife. The launch officer's flag dropped. The first Devastator rolled forward, gained speed, lifted off the deck. One by one, the torpedo bombers departed the Hornet. When Gay's turn came, he pushed the throttle forward, felt the aircraft accelerate, watched the deck edge approach, and then they were airborne, climbing into the morning sky over a Pacific Ocean that stretched empty and blue in every direction. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, the Japanese fleet waited. Somewhere out there, history would turn on what happened in the next few hours. Gay could not know that within 90 minutes he would be the only man from his squadron left alive. The Douglas TBD Devastator represented American naval aviation thinking from the mid-1930s when it was designed. At the time of its introduction in 1937, it was revolutionary, the Navy's first all-metal monoplane, the first with a fully enclosed cockpit, the first with hydraulically folding wings for carrier storage. It incorporated innovations that seemed cutting-edge: a variable pitch propeller, wing flaps, and a 3-man crew arranged to maximize operational efficiency. But aviation technology advanced rapidly in the late 1930s. By the time war came to the Pacific, the Devastator's limitations were glaring. The Pratt & Whitney R1830-64 radial engine produced just 900 horsepower, barely adequate to lift the aircraft, crew, and torpedo off a carrier deck. When carrying a Mark 13 torpedo weighing 2,000 pounds, the aircraft struggled to maintain altitude. Pilots described the sensation of flying a Devastator with a torpedo as trying to fly a truck through molasses. The tactical doctrine for torpedo attacks required aircraft to approach their targets at low altitude, ideally below 100 feet, flying slow and straight during the final run to ensure accurate torpedo drops. This made torpedo bombers extraordinarily vulnerable to both anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception. American doctrine assumed that fighter escorts would suppress enemy defenses, that dive bombers would attack simultaneously to divide defensive fire, and that multiple torpedo bombers attacking from different angles would overwhelm a target's ability to maneuver. The theory was sound. The reality at Midway would be catastrophic. The Japanese carriers represented a different philosophy of naval warfare. The Akagi had been converted from a battlecruiser hull, displacing 36,000 tons and capable of carrying 66 aircraft. The Kaga, converted from a battleship hull, displaced 38,000 tons and carried 90 aircraft. The Soryu and Hiryu were purpose-built carriers of smaller size but modern design, each carrying 60 to 70 aircraft. Together, these 4 carriers formed the Kido Butai, the first mobile strike force, the most powerful naval aviation arm in the world. Their aircraft were superior to American planes in nearly every measurable way. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter could outclimb, outturn, and outmaneuver any American fighter in service. Its 20mm cannons outranged American 50-caliber machine guns. The Aichi D-3A dive bomber, called the Val by the Allies, had proved devastatingly accurate in attacks from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. The Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber, the Kate, carried a reliable torpedo and had the speed and range to conduct strikes at distances American torpedo bombers could not match. More importantly, the Japanese pilots were veterans. Many had flown combat missions over China since 1937. They had trained together for years, perfecting coordinated strikes that combined dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters into integrated packages that overwhelmed defenses through precisely timed attacks from multiple vectors. They had struck Pearl Harbor, devastated the British Eastern Fleet in the Indian Ocean, sunk the British carrier Hermes, and sent the heavy cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire to the bottom. They had never been defeated in a major engagement. American intelligence knew the Japanese were planning something. Navy cryptanalysts working in a basement at Pearl Harbor had been breaking Japanese naval codes for months, painstakingly reconstructing enemy communications one fragment at a time. They learned of a planned operation against a target identified only as AF. Commander Joseph Rochefort, leading the cryptanalysis effort, believed AF was Midway Island. To confirm this, he arranged for Midway to send an uncoded message reporting a water distillation plant breakdown. Within days, Japanese communications mentioned that AF was short of fresh water. The identification was confirmed. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, committed everything available to defend Midway and ambush the Japanese carriers. The Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown positioned themselves northeast of Midway, waiting. The carriers launched scout planes at dawn on June 4th to locate the Japanese fleet. When contact was made, they would launch everything they had, The American strike plan relied on coordinated attacks that would hit the Japanese carriers simultaneously from multiple directions. Torpedo bombers would attack at low altitude from one vector, forcing the Japanese combat air patrol down to wave-top height. While the Zeros were engaged low, dive bombers would attack from 15,000 feet, plunging nearly to vertically onto carrier flight decks where aircraft were armed, fueled, and vulnerable. Fighter escorts would suppress the defending Zeros and protect the bombers during their approaches. It was a good plan. It required precise timing, accurate navigation, and radio communication to coordinate the separate squadrons. It required that all elements arrive at the target simultaneously to achieve the concentration of force that would overwhelm Japanese defenses. At Midway, almost nothing went according to plan. The launch from the 3 American carriers took longer than anticipated. Different squadrons departed at different times. The Hornet's air group, led by Commander Stanhope Ring, flew on an incorrect heading that took the dive bombers and fighters away from the Japanese fleet entirely. Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Commander Waldron, broke formation and flew on a separate heading based on Waldron's intuition about where the Japanese would be. His guess proved correct, but it left his 15 torpedo bombers approaching the enemy fleet alone, without fighter cover or dive bomber support. Enterprise's air group experienced similar coordination problems. The dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, flew the briefed intercept course but found empty ocean. McCluskey made the crucial decision to continue searching rather than return to the carrier. Fuel was running dangerously low. Some aircraft would not make it back regardless of whether they found the enemy. McCluskey pushed on, flying an expanding square search pattern, gambling that the Japanese carriers were somewhere in the area. At 10:20 in the morning, McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer steaming at high speed, leaving a distinctive wake across the calm sea. The destroyer was the Arashi, racing to catch up with the main carrier force after being left behind to depth charge the American submarine Nautilus. McCluskey recognized what he was seeing, a ship rejoining its formation. He turned his 2 dive bomber squadrons to follow the destroyer's heading. 37 Douglas TBD Dauntless dive bombers changed course, following the wake that would lead them to their targets. Yorktown's air group launched an hour later than the others, but flew a direct course to the Japanese fleet. The strike coordinator had better information about the enemy's position and could plot a more accurate intercept. Torpedo Squadron 3, flying obsolete Devastators like those from the Hornet, approached with fighter escort from Fighting Squadron 3. 17 dive bombers from Bombing Squadron 3 followed. What none of the American pilots knew was that the Japanese carriers were in the middle of a crucial rearm and refuel cycle. Admiral Nagumo had launched a strike against Midway Island at dawn. That strike had inflicted damage but failed to neutralize the island's defenses. The strike commander radioed back that a second attack was necessary. Nagumo faced a decision. Keep his reserve strike force armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacking enemy ships, as doctrine required, or rearm them with land attack weapons for another strike on Midway. He chose to rearm for a land attack. Below decks on all 4 carriers, ordnance crews began the dangerous work of removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs from aircraft and replacing them with high-explosive land bombs. Torpedoes were set aside on the hangar decks. Fuel lines were opened to top off aircraft tanks. Then, at 7:28 in the morning, Nagumo received the report he had been dreading. Enemy ships sighted to the northeast, including what appeared to be a carrier. He immediately ordered his aircraft rearmed again, this time back to anti-ship weapons. The ordnance crews worked frantically. Time was running out. Torpedo Squadron 8 reached the Japanese fleet first. Commander Waldron led his 15 Devastators toward 4 carriers arranged in a box formation, with battleships and cruisers surrounding them in a protective screen. Destroyers patrolled the perimeter. Above the formation, circling at various altitudes, dozens of Zero fighters maintained combat air patrol. It was 9:20 in the morning. The Japanese had spotted the approaching torpedo bombers and vectored fighters to intercept. Waldron knew what was about to happen. He had told his pilots repeatedly during training that if they encountered the enemy without support, they would press the attack anyway. There would be no turning back, no breaking off, no saving themselves by jettisoning torpedoes and running for cloud cover. They would attack because that was their job, because the carriers needed to be stopped, because turning away meant the mission failed and other men would have to try again. He led them in. The Zeros came at them in pairs and trios, attacking from high and ahead, diving through the formation, firing, then pulling up and around for another pass. The Devastators were so slow, flying at barely more than 100 miles per hour with their torpedoes, that the Zeros had to throttle back to avoid overshooting. Zero pilots later reported that the American torpedo planes seemed to hang in the air, almost motionless, perfect targets. The Devastator's rear gunners fired their single .30 caliber machine guns, achieving almost nothing against aircraft that could attack from any angle. George Gay was flying in the last group of 3 aircraft. From his position at the rear of the formation, he watched Zeros tear into the lead planes. He saw Devastators stagger in the air as cannon shells struck home. He saw one aircraft burst into flames, the pilot trying to maintain control as fire consumed the engine and cockpit. The burning plane held steady for a moment, still flying toward the carriers, then rolled inverted and plunged into the ocean. Another Devastator exploded in midair when a Zero's cannon round hit the torpedo beneath it, detonating 2,000 pounds of high explosive and vaporizing the aircraft and crew in an instant. Waldron's plane went down, then the next, and the next. The Zeros worked methodically through the formation, concentrating fire on one aircraft until it fell, then moving to the next. The Devastators had no defense except to keep flying, keep formation, keep moving toward the drop point where they could release their torpedoes, and perhaps, if they survived that long, try to escape. Gay watched his squadron die in the space of 10 minutes. He counted the splashes as aircraft hit the water. He saw parachutes, though not many. The Devastators flew too low for parachutes to deploy properly. Most crews went down with their planes. He felt impacts as machine gun bullets struck his own aircraft, heard his rear gunner, Robert Huntington, firing back. Then there were just 3 Devastators left. Then 2. Then only Gay's aircraft was still flying. Behind him, Huntington stopped firing. Gay glanced back and saw his gunner, slumped in his position, hit multiple times. Blood covered the rear cockpit. Gay was alone, flying a dying aircraft toward a Japanese carrier that loomed ahead, massive and close. Anti-aircraft fire from the destroyers and cruisers filled the air with black puffs and tracers. More Zeros were positioning for another attack. Gay pushed forward, committed to the attack run, released his torpedo at close range, saw it splash into the water and begin its run toward the carrier. The carrier turned, easily avoiding the single torpedo. Gay pulled up slightly, flew directly over the carrier's flight deck so close he could see crew members and aircraft, saw Zeros landing, saw organized chaos as the ship prepared to launch another strike. Then his aircraft was past the carrier, over open water, and Zeros were on him again. Cannon shells shredded his rudder and elevator. The Devastator became unflyable. Gay had perhaps 5 seconds. He cut his engine, tried to control the descent, and hit the water hard. Gay came to consciousness floating in the water. His aircraft had sunk immediately,
taking Huntington's body with it. Gay was injured, his left hand badly wounded from bullet or shrapnel, his body bruised from the impact. He had managed to get out of the cockpit as the plane went down. Now he floated in a life jacket, surrounded by debris from his squadron's aircraft. Rubber rafts, seat cushions, pieces of wing and fuselage littered the ocean surface. Bodies floated nearby. He was in the middle of the Japanese fleet. Destroyers passed within hundreds of yards. He could see sailors on their decks, see the carriers in the distance, see Zeros circling overhead. He found a rubber seat cushion and pulled it over his head, creating a small airspace beneath it where he could breathe while remaining nearly invisible from above. Under this inadequate shelter, treading water in the middle of the enemy fleet, George Gay watched the rest of the battle unfold. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the east. Enterprise attacked next, 14 Devastators led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. They approached from a different angle than Squadron 8, but they faced the same defenders, the same overwhelming fighter opposition, the same intensive anti-aircraft fire. Lindsay's aircraft was one of the first shot down. 10 of the 14 Devastators were destroyed. Not one torpedo hit a target. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown arrived with fighter escort, 12 Devastators protected by 6 Wildcat fighters. The Wildcats engaged the Zeros, but there were too many Japanese fighters and they were too experienced. The Zeros simply absorbed the fighter opposition and continued attacking the torpedo bombers. 10 of the 12 Devastators were shot down. Again, not one torpedo found its target. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 41 torpedo bombers had attacked the Japanese carriers. 35 had been shot down. More than 80 American aviators were dead or dying. Not one torpedo had struck a Japanese ship. From the Japanese perspective, the battle appeared to be a comprehensive victory. Their fighters had massacred 3 separate torpedo bomber attacks. Their carriers remained undamaged. Their own strike aircraft were being rearmed and prepared for launch. Once they could get their attack planes in the air, they would find and destroy the American carriers. What the Japanese did not see, what they could not see because their fighters were at wave-top height destroying torpedo bombers, was that Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from the Enterprise had arrived overhead at 15,000 feet. 37 Douglas TBD Dauntless dive bombers circled above the Japanese fleet, their crews watching the carnage below, waiting for the right moment to attack. McCluskey had followed the destroyer Arashi's wake straight to the carriers. His timing was perfect, though purely accidental. The torpedo bombers had drawn every Zero fighter down to low altitude. The sky above 15,000 feet was empty. The Japanese carriers were vulnerable in a way they had never been before. Their flight decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. Their hangar decks held more aircraft, torpedoes stacked carelessly, fuel lines open, bombs scattered during the frantic rearming process. They were floating munitions warehouses waiting for a spark. At 10:22 in the morning, McCluskey pushed over into his dive. Behind him, 36 more Dauntlesses nosed over and began their dives. The aircraft plunged nearly vertically, diving brakes deployed to control their speed, bomb sights centered on the carrier decks below. The crews had trained for this. They knew their aircraft, knew the sight picture, knew when to release. At 2,000 feet, they released their 1,000-pound bombs and pulled out of their dives, engines screaming, G-forces crushing pilots into their seats. The first bomb hit the Akagi near the midship elevator. It penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the upper hangar, where armed and fueled aircraft were packed together. The explosion ignited fuel and detonated bombs and torpedoes. Fire spread instantly through the hangar deck. The second bomb hit the Akagi moments later, near the same location, compounding the damage. Fire consumed the ship from within. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the Kido Butai from Akagi's bridge, watched his flagship transform into an inferno. He had just minutes to make a decision: stay and try to save the ship, or transfer his flag to another vessel and continue commanding the fleet. He chose to transfer, climbing down ladders and across listing decks as explosions ripped through the carrier below him. He reached a destroyer and continued to issue orders even as his flagship died behind him. The Kaga took 4 bomb hits in rapid succession. The first bomb struck near the bridge, killing most of the command staff instantly. The second and third bombs hit the flight deck amidships, penetrating to the hangar decks where they set off the same catastrophic chain reaction of fuel and ordnance explosions. The fourth bomb hit near the stern. Within minutes, the Kaga was ablaze from bow to stern. Damage control parties tried to fight the fires but had no chance. The flames were too intense, the ammunition detonations too frequent. Men who stayed below decks were trapped and burned. Men who came topside faced a choice between burning and jumping into the ocean. Many chose the ocean. The Soryu received 3 bomb hits, all within a span of 2 minutes. The first bomb struck just forward of the midship elevator, blasting through the wooden flight deck and exploding among aircraft on the hangar deck. The second bomb hit amidships, detonating in the hangar and setting off a massive secondary explosion as stored torpedoes exploded sympathetically. The third bomb hit near the stern. Like the other carriers, Soryu became an instant inferno. Her captain ordered the crew to abandon ship within 20 minutes of the first bomb impact. There was nothing else to do. The fires were uncontrollable. 3 Japanese carriers transformed from operational warships into burning hulks in the space of 6 minutes. 6 minutes. The dive bombers had achieved what 41 torpedo bombers could not. They had caught the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment, with aircraft on deck being armed and fueled, with ordnance scattered around the hangar decks, with damage control parties unprepared because the crews had been at battle stations dealing with torpedo attacks for the previous hour. The timing was accidental, the result of poor coordination and failed plans, but it was devastatingly effective. From his hiding place in the water, George Gay watched the carriers burn. He saw the Kaga list heavily, saw men jumping from her decks, saw small craft approaching to rescue survivors. He saw the Akagi dead in the water, smoke pouring from her flight deck. He watched as the battle continued around him, as the 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, launched a counterattack against the American carriers. He saw Zeros and dive bombers departing, heading east toward where they believed the American carriers to be. He watched for hours, drifting in his life jacket, with the seat cushion over his head, trying to remain inconspicuous among the debris. The realization of what had happened came slowly. The torpedo attacks had failed completely. Every pilot who flew a torpedo bomber that morning had expected that some would be shot down, that losses would be heavy, but that some torpedoes would hit and some crews would survive. The reality was more absolute. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that attacked, only 6 returned to their carriers. 35 aircraft lost, 80 men dead, and nothing to show for it except the inadvertent service of drawing Japanese fighters down to low altitude, leaving the sky clear for the dive bombers. The dive bombers accomplished everything. They arrived at the right moment, attacked from an undefended altitude, hit their targets precisely, and changed the course of the Pacific War in 6 minutes of combat. Their success was clean, measurable, undeniable. 3 Japanese carriers burning, the myth of Japanese invincibility shattered, the balance of naval power in the Pacific fundamentally altered. George Gay spent more than 30 hours in the water, The battle moved away from him as the day progressed. He watched the Hiryu launch its counterattack and saw American dive bombers return in the late afternoon to attack the fourth carrier. He watched that ship, too, begin to burn. He watched the sun set on June 4th, watched darkness fall across the Pacific, watched the stars come out. He was alone in an ocean that stretched 3,000 miles in every direction. His left hand had swollen to nearly twice its normal size. He was nauseated from swallowing seawater. He drifted in and out of consciousness. On the morning of June 5th, he heard an aircraft engine. A PBY Catalina patrol bomber was searching the battle area. Someone in the crew spotted his yellow life raft. The pilot, Lieutenant William Cole, circled once, saw Gay signal that he was alive, then continued his patrol. Gay thought he had been abandoned. He lost consciousness again. Hours later, he woke to the sound of the same aircraft returning. Cole brought the PBY down onto the ocean surface and taxied to Gay's position. Crew members helped him through the open hatch. They gave him water, though he could not keep it down. When Gay told them he had witnessed 3 Japanese carriers burning, Cole immediately headed for Midway Island. Gay was flown to Pearl Harbor Naval Hospital, where he spent weeks recovering. His hand required surgery. His story spread quickly through the Navy. He was the sole survivor of Torpedo. Squadron 8's carrier contingent, the only man who could testify firsthand about what had happened during those desperate attacks. Admiral Chester Nimitz visited him personally. Reporters wanted interviews. Life magazine featured him on its cover in August 1942. He was offered a movie deal by 20th Century Fox. He refused it. The psychological weight of survival was crushing. 29 of his squadron mates were dead. He had watched them die, watched their aircraft fall from the sky, seen the ocean swallow them. He had survived by accident, by happening to be in the right position to ditch successfully, by finding a seat cushion to hide under, by being spotted by a patrol plane. Survivor's guilt would haunt him for the rest of his life. He never claimed to be a hero. He insisted he had simply been lucky. After recovering from his wounds, Gay returned to combat duty. He was assigned to Torpedo Squadron 11 and flew missions from Guadalcanal through mid-1943. He earned an Air Medal for his combat missions in the Solomon Islands. Later in the war, he served as a flight instructor at Naval Air Station Jacksonville, Florida, training the next generation of torpedo bomber pilots. He taught them about the Devastator's limitations, about the importance of fighter cover, about the brutal mathematics of attacking defended ships with obsolete aircraft. The other survivors of the torpedo bomber attacks at Midway faced similar struggles. The men who made it back to their carriers had to process what they had experienced. They had flown into a killing zone knowing the odds were against them. They had watched their friends die. They had pressed attacks that failed, dropped torpedoes that missed or malfunctioned, and somehow survived to return to their ships. The casualty rate among torpedo bomber crews at Midway was 85%. No other branch of American military service in World War II experienced losses that severe in a single engagement. The Japanese carrier crews who survived faced different demons. More than 2,000 Japanese sailors died on the 4 carriers. The men who were rescued from the burning ships had watched their vessels, which they had believed invincible, destroyed in minutes. They had trained for years, fought across the Pacific, never experienced defeat, and then suddenly their world was fire and chaos and men drowning in burning oil. The survivors were isolated when they returned to Japan, forbidden from discussing what had happened, shipped to distant postings where they could not spread their knowledge of defeat. The Battle of Midway ended on June 7, 1942. All 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. The Akagi and Kaga succumbed to their internal fires and were scuttled by Japanese destroyers. The Sortie sank on the evening of June 4th. The Hiryu, attacked by dive bombers from the Enterprise in the late afternoon of June 4th, burned through the night and sank early on June 5th. The United States lost the carrier Yorktown, torpedoed by a Japanese submarine on June 6th while under tow back to Pearl Harbor, and the destroyer Hammond, which sank in minutes after being torpedoed while alongside the Yorktown. The strategic consequences were immediate and irreversible. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers and their irreplaceable air groups. More than 248 aircraft were destroyed. 3,000 Japanese sailors and aircrew died, including many of the most experienced pilots in the Imperial Japanese Navy. These men could not be replaced. Japan's pilot training program was small, focused on quality over quantity, and it could not produce experienced aviators fast enough to offset combat losses. The Americans, by contrast, had established massive training programs that would eventually produce 15,000 new pilots per year. The carrier losses were equally catastrophic. Japan began the war with 10 fleet carriers and light carriers. In 6 months, they had lost 5. The Shoho at Coral Sea in May, and now the 4 fleet carriers at Midway. Japanese shipyards could not replace these losses quickly. The Taiho would not be completed until 1944. The Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, would not enter service until late 1944 and would be sunk by an American submarine 10 days after commissioning. Japanese industrial capacity simply could not sustain losses at the rate combat was inflicting them. American industrial capacity was different. The United States had 7 fleet carriers in commission when the war began. By the end of 1942, that number had grown to 10 despite losing the Lexington at Coral Sea, the Yorktown at Midway, the Wasp to submarine attack, and the Hornet at the Battle of Santa Cruz. New carriers were sliding down the ways at shipyards across America. The Essex-class carriers, larger and more capable than the pre-war designs, would begin entering service in 1943. By war's end, the United States would have commissioned 24 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and more than 100 escort carriers. The industrial disparity was staggering. The Battle of Midway demonstrated that disparity in miniature. American pilots flew obsolete torpedo bombers and suffered catastrophic losses, but the dive bombers that followed achieved devastating success. The aircraft carriers that served as mobile airfields were supported by supply ships, tankers, repair vessels, and a logistics network that stretched back across the Pacific to bases in Hawaii and California, and ultimately to factories in America's industrial heartland. When aircraft were lost, they were replaced. When pilots were killed, new pilots graduated from training programs and filled the empty cockpits. When ships were damaged, they went to shipyards where thousands of workers repaired them in weeks rather than months. Japan could not match this system. Japanese pilots who were killed were gone forever, their experience and skill irreplaceable. Japanese aircraft that were destroyed could not be quickly replaced because factories were operating at maximum capacity and could not expand production without resources that were no longer available. Japanese ships that were damaged faced long repair times because shipyards were few and already overwhelmed. The arithmetic of attrition favored the Americans overwhelmingly, and Midway was the moment when that arithmetic began to assert itself with brutal clarity. The psychological impact extended beyond individual survivors. The Japanese Navy had believed itself superior in training, tactics, and equipment. The carrier strike force had operated with impunity across the Pacific for 6 months. Then, in one morning, half their carrier strength was destroyed by an enemy they had underestimated. The myth of invincibility collapsed. Japanese naval officers began to understand that they were in a war they could not win through tactical brilliance alone. The title of this story suggests a young pilot on his first sortie, accidentally sinking 2 destroyers. The historical reality was both more complex and more profound. George Gay was 25 years old, not 20, when he flew his first combat mission at Midway. He did not sink destroyers or carriers. His torpedo missed. His entire squadron was annihilated without achieving a single hit. Yet the mission succeeded in ways no one anticipated. The torpedo bombers drew Japanese fighters down to wavetop height, clearing the sky for dive bombers that arrived at exactly the right moment to strike 4 carriers loaded with armed and fueled aircraft. The success was not accidental. It was the product of courage, training, and the brutal arithmetic of industrial warfare. The young men who flew at Midway were not seasoned veterans. Many had earned their wings less than a year before the battle. George Gay had never dropped a torpedo from a carrier deck until the morning of June 4th. Ensign Dusty Kleiss, flying a dive bomber from the Enterprise, scored hits on 3 separate Japanese ships during the battle, becoming the only pilot at Midway to achieve 3 confirmed hits. He was 26 years old. Lieutenant Richard Best, commanding Bombing Squadron 6 from the Enterprise, scored direct hits on both the Akagi and the Hiryu, becoming one of only 2 pilots in the entire war to score damaging hits on 2 carriers in a single day. He was 32, old by aviator standards, but he had spent most of his career as a fighter pilot and had transitioned to dive bombers only 2 years before Midway. These men achieved remarkable things, not through long experience, but through thorough training, adequate equipment, and the support of a nation whose industrial capacity could sustain losses and replace them. The torpedo bombers that died at Midway were obsolete, but newer. Aircraft were already in production. The pilots who died could not be replaced as individuals, but the training programs that had produced them continued to operate, graduating new classes of aviators every month. The carriers that were damaged could be repaired in shipyards that worked around the clock. The system was resilient in a way the Japanese system was not. The Battle of Midway did not end the Pacific War. 2.5 more years of brutal combat lay ahead. More carriers would be sunk on both sides. More pilots would die in air combat, in accidents, in kamikaze attacks during the war's final desperate year. The island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific would consume tens of thousands of lives. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 would kill hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. But Midway was the moment when the trajectory of the war became clear to those who understood what had happened. George Gay survived the war and spent 30 years as a commercial airline pilot for Trans World Airlines. He occasionally spoke at military history conferences, always reluctant to claim hero status, always insistent that the real heroes were the men who died. He wrote a memoir titled Sole Survivor that described his experiences with brutal honesty. He died in October 1994 at the age of 77, one of the last living witnesses to one of the most decisive naval battles in history. The story of Midway is not the story of one young pilot accidentally achieving greatness. It is the story of many young pilots, most of them inexperienced, flying aircraft that ranged from obsolete to adequate, achieving victory through courage, training, and the support of a nation that could afford to lose battles and still win the war. The torpedo bombers failed tactically, but succeeded strategically. The dive bombers succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Together, they changed history in 6 minutes of combat on a June morning in 1942. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.